On September 4th, 1872, the New York Sun published the birth announcement of the Gilded Age. It came in the form of a story that was simultaneously turgid and sensational, error-filled, but essentially accurate. An expose of a business with the exotic name of Credit Mobilier, more about the pronunciation in a minute, and the efforts of one of its biggest investors, a Massachusetts Republican congressman named Oakes Ames, to plant company stock with members of Congress to promote the interests of its sole customer, the government-backed Union Pacific Railroad. The headlines told the tale in the Sun's characteristically flamboyant style. At the top of the story, the one-column headline read, "The King of Frauds." Provocative subheads elaborated on the theme: colossal bribery, how the Credit Mobilier bought its way through Congress, and congressmen who robbed the people and now support the national robber. In the story itself, which filled the entire front page of the four-page Sun and spilled over into pages 2 and 3, the Sun promised that its revelations represented what it called the most damaging exhibition of official and private villainy ever laid bare to the gaze of the world. The leading figures in the tale included a representative sample of the politicians and business leaders of the day. At the center of the drama was Ames of Massachusetts, a railroad financier known as the King of Spades because of his family's shovel-making business. Ames's role in Credit Mobilier earned him another nickname, courtesy of the wags who wrote the headlines at the New York Herald: Hoax Ames. Ames's rival in the tale was Henry Simpson Macomb, a Delaware railroad speculator described by one journalist as jealous of money and belligerent when deprived of his share of it. Macomb sued Ames to obtain more shares of Credit Mobilier, and his deposition testimony, given over a period of months, formed the basis of the Sun's story. Indeed, it was the story, because after a brief introduction, the Sun's exclusive consisted entirely of transcripts of Macomb's testimony. Other figures caught up in the scandal and subsequent investigations included Vice President Schuyler Colfax, nicknamed Smiler, to connote his easy amiability and lack of gravitas; Democrat James Brooks of New York, an unprincipled Southern sympathizer known for his bitter partisanship and hatred of African Americans; Pig Iron Kelly, a Republican from Pennsylvania who earned his moniker for his persistent advocacy of iron tariffs; and Luke Potter Poland of Vermont, the Republican who led the primary House investigation into the scandal, whose deportment reminded one observer of what she called, as she put it, a Methodist minister of the best type, who in some hour of weakness backslid into the American Congress. Credit Mobilier is one of those phrases many of us dimly recall, if we remember it at all, from our high school or college U.S. history courses. It has been largely forgotten because it unfolded in that dismal period between Appomattox and the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Historian Richard White calls it the flyover territory of U.S. history. The company took its name from a powerful French banking house of the period. Union Pacific Vice President Thomas C. Durant, something of a buccaneer himself and known as the Napoleon of railways, wanted to borrow a little of the French company's glamour and prestige, but he merely confused the public with a strange-sounding name. As a California newspaper asked in 1873, how is it pronounced? There were various renderings at the time according to published reports. Lawmakers pronounced it Credit Mobilier, Credit Mobilia, Credit Mobilier, Credit Mobilia, Credit Mobilier, and Credit Mobilie. Now, I'm from Chicago, where we pronounce Goethe Street as Goethe Street. So at the risk of offending the French scholars in the audience, I'm sticking with my roots and choosing the next to last option for the remainder of tonight's talk, Credit Mobilier. And if I get talking too fast, it'll sound different. Credit Mobilier is the first great Washington scandal of the modern era, unfolding 50 years before Teapot Dome and 100 years before Watergate. More than that, it represents a watershed in U.S. history. At one level, the Credit Mobilier story is a tale of hard-nosed Washington politics. Democrats and liberal Republicans exploited the revelations to pummel Republicans and the Grant administration during the presidential campaign of 1872. While the story made little difference in the outcome of the election, it proved to have a life of its own. After Grant's landslide victory, congressional Republicans scrambled to get ahead of the scandal with an investigation into the allegations of bribery, but they bungled their attempts to manage the inquiry. A cunning Washington insider worked all sides of the affair, representing Macomb, leaking the story to the Sun, and counseling one of the Republican members linked to Credit Mobilier. Blunders by members of Congress and the committees that investigated the scandal magnified public outrage and transformed Credit Mobilier from just another episode of partisan mudslinging into a genuine political sensation. Connoisseurs of Washington's scandal will recognize and marvel at the machinations and missteps that mark the story of the Credit Mobilier affair. But the emergence of the scandal as a defining event of the Gilded Age has as much to do with the changing nature of American politics in the years after the Civil War as sensational headlines or political miscalculations. As the American economy staggered toward industrialization, Credit Mobilier called attention to the cozy relationship between members of Congress and the railroads that was becoming increasingly troublesome to many Americans. The detailed and unseemly revelations that emerged from the scandal raised disturbing questions about the exercise of influence by corporate interests in Washington that far exceeded concerns about the relatively small sums of money involved. The modest profiteering by lawmakers implicated in the scandal was relatively insignificant, except, as the Baltimore Sun put it, as it pertained to what the Sun called the fitness of such a man for continued trust. The Sun went on, but that the legislation of the country should be influenced and controlled, notoriously and undeniably so, by such agencies and means comes home, or should come home, to the breast of every citizen and patriot. The specter that troubled the Baltimore Sun and even perhaps the New York Sun was the corrupting influence of monopoly power on the political system. Corruption, historian Richard White writes in the introduction to his fantastic new history of the period, The Republic for Which It Stands, was the defining characteristic of the period. The Gilded Age was corrupt, and corruption in government and business mattered, White writes. Corruption suffused government and the economy. Friendship defined the relation between public officials and businessmen, and officials from postmasters to deputy sheriffs and judges received fees for services. Lavish subsidies went to private corporations such as transcontinental railroads, and the government subcontracted public responsibilities to a variety of entities. It is more than coincidental, I would argue, that a year after the Credit Mobilier scandal spilled across the front pages of the New York Sun, authors Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner finished their sprawling novel about speculation, corruption, and Washington. The novel's title, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, gave us the catchphrase used to describe the second half of the 19th century. Credit Mobilier came to embody the sleazy self-dealing that characterized politics and business in the years after the Civil War, not only because of the disclosures that members of Congress were profiting from it, but because of the very nature of the business itself. The company, whose stock Ames was distributing, began life before the war as the brainchild of Duff Green, a one-time ally of Andrew Jackson, who had turned to speculation in railroads, mining, and canals in the late 1850s. Originally named the Pennsylvania Fiscal Agency after the state where it was chartered, the business languished as hostilities commenced, but came to life in 1864, when it was acquired by Durant. He quickly changed its name to Credit Mobilier to lend it the cachet of a powerful French banking firm of the period. He had big plans for the enterprise. Durant intended to use Credit Mobilier to strengthen the financial posture of the Union Pacific, which, despite the generosity of the federal government and widespread public support for a transcontinental railroad, was struggling to raise money. With Congress setting the price at which the Union Pacific could sell its stock, requiring investors to pay cash, and making stockholders liable for the railroad's debts, it was difficult to raise capital to build the road. The predicament threatened to halt construction, but Ames sensed opportunity where others saw only risk. In August 1865, Ames told John B. Alley, a Massachusetts congressman and friend, that he saw a way out of the railroad's dilemma. I have been looking into this thing, and I think it is a practical scheme, and I want you to go in with me, Alley recalled being urged. The practical scheme, hatched by Durant and endorsed by Ames, required the Union Pacific to hire Credit Mobilier to build sections of the railroad and take payment in bonds and Union Pacific stock. The plan offered a number of advantages. Unlike the railroad, Credit Mobilier could sell Union Pacific securities for less than the prices set by the government. The construction company could then ensure profits for its investors by inflating the cost of its work. Credit Mobilier also offered protection. If the Union Pacific failed, potential losses for investors would be limited to the degree they backed Credit Mobilier. Most significantly, because of many of the Union Pacific's leading officials were also directors of Credit Mobilier, they were paying themselves to build the railroad. The idea was familiar to Ames, who had used a similar approach to finance the construction of a railroad in Iowa. Ames, according to Alley, said he would, quote, take hold of Credit Mobilier with his brother Oliver and offered assurances that, quote, there is no danger if it's properly managed. Credit Mobilier stock was a hot commodity in the winter of 1867-1868 when Ames peddled shares on Capitol Hill at their original price of $100 per share, well below their perceived and actual value. Credit Mobilier made a lot of money. By one estimate, $30 million alone for building one section of the railroad, and the stock dividends were appropriately lavish. Beneficiaries of Ames' largesse were a who's who of Congress, including Smiler Schuyler Colfax, who bought shares while he was House Speaker in 1868, James Garfield of Ohio, a rising star on Capitol Hill and future president, Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, who had been nominated by Republicans to replace Colfax as Grant's running mate, Pig Iron Kelly, Blackjack John Logan of Illinois, the radical Republican who served as a House prosecutor during Andrew Johnson's impeachment, and who once declared on the House floor that Jefferson Davis should be tried for treason and shot. John Bingham of Ohio, also a Johnson prosecutor and one of the authors of the 14th Amendment. All told, Ames sold Credit Mobilier shares to at least 11 members of Congress during the winter of 1867 and 1868. The transactions were an open secret on Capitol Hill. One Washington correspondent, Uriah Hunt Painter, learned about the stock sales, but instead of disclosing them in the papers for which he wrote, he chose to buy shares instead. In 1869, Charles Francis Adams Jr., writing in the North American Review, warned of Credit Mobilier's spreading influence in Congress. But the expose in the Sun put the matter before the public in a way that could not be ignored. What was widely suspected, but not known at the time, was that Ames had some ulterior motive in selling the shares. The Sun confirmed the worst fears of many by revealing that Ames had admitted as much in letters he wrote to Macomb. Macomb was pressuring Ames for additional Credit Mobilier shares in the winter of 1868. Ames kept putting him off, and at one point explained why. He had no more Credit Mobilier shares to spare, Ames confided, because he needed all that he had to promote the interests of Credit Mobilier's parent company, the Union Pacific, on Capitol Hill. We want more friends in this Congress, Ames told Macomb in one letter, and if a man will look into the law and it is difficult to get them to do so unless they have an interest to do so, he cannot help being convinced that we should not be interfered with. Macomb was not pacified and ended up filing suit against Ames seeking more Credit Mobilier shares. His attorney, Jeremiah Sullivan Black, knew he was sitting on dynamite, and Black advised one of his friends, James A. Garfield, about the legal and political risks involved in owning Credit Mobilier shares. But Black was also a partisan Democrat, and the story of how Credit Mobilier ended up in the pages of the Sun is one of the most interesting aspects of the scandal. In early 1868, a Republican editor in New York warned Representative Eli Washburn about Credit Mobilier, about disclosures about Credit Mobilier made in a New York court case that the editor said revealed what he called an almost incredible amount of corruption connected with the Union Pacific and most especially the Credit Mobilier. The editor decided to sit on the story rather than publish it, though, because he feared it would hurt Republican prospects in the upcoming election. 4 years later, no such qualms inhibited Black or Charles A. Dana the mercurial editor of The Sun. The newspaper routinely referred to the president in headlines as useless Grant. One of its Washington correspondents, Albert M. Gibson, was friendly with Democratic politicians from his home state of Pennsylvania, including Jeremiah Black. As McComb's suit against Ames unfolded in the Philadelphia courts, Black arranged for the story to be leaked to Gibson. When it was published, it was a genuine blockbuster. On a typical day, as many as 50 news items, many no more than a paragraph or two in length, might crowd page 1 of the New York Sun. The edition of September 4th, 1872 was different. The credit Mobilier scoop filled the entire front page, all but the editorial column on page 2, and jumped into a column on page 3 of the 4-page publication. Now, this is just before newspapers began to run illustrations and decades before they had photographs. So the New York Sun that day was the front page was basically a giant block of gray text broken up by a few sensational subheads here and there. Below the one-column headline, "The King of Frauds," additional headings hammered the point home, as we've discussed. How the credit Mobilier bought its way through Congress, colossal bribery, and congressmen who have robbed the people and who now support the national robber. At the top of the story, bold type blasted the most shocking, although inaccurately reported, aspect of the paper's exclusive. From 2,000 to 3,000 shares each to Henry Wilson, Schuyler Colfax, George Boutwell, John Bingham, James Garfield, and a number of others. Inflammatory subheads broke up the mass of gray type and stoked the outrage needed to drive readers to the end of the story. Gibson, the unnamed author of the piece, avowed that he would prefer to believe that lawmakers named were innocent. But there is no escaping the conclusion, Gibson wrote in the New York Sun, that they are guilty. This is the no-holds-barred journalism of the 1870s, almost completely without even the pretense of objectivity or impartiality. The piece expresses the hope that no one, quote, who has any respect for the honor of his country and love for our institutions will by his vote aid to maintain these men in place and power. There is no indication that the Sun attempted to give Ames, a representative of Credit Mobilier, or any of the members of Congress or Grant administration named in the story, a chance to respond to the allegations. Serious factual errors and reckless imprecision abound. The Sun grossly overstated the amount of stock sold by Ames. None of the lawmakers mentioned by the newspaper bought more than 150 shares. Most bought no more than 30, and several did not obtain any Credit Mobilier stock at all. One headline characterized the transaction as princely gifts, but many of the congressmen paid up front for their shares. Moreover, the story is not a narrative or assemblage of facts. Gibson hastily cobbled together the testimony of Macomb given over the course of the previous year, and the Sun printed the transcripts in chronological order, according to the dates when Macomb was questioned. After a relatively brief introduction, the entire piece consists of Macomb's answers to questions from his lawyers and attorneys for Ames. The most explosive details of Macomb's testimony appear at the end when he read 2 letters from Ames and his list of congressional purchasers into the transcript. Now, that aspect of this has always struck me as peculiar, but this was before the days of what journalists call the inverted pyramid, where you put the most interesting or salient or sensational information at the top of the story and you work your way down. As a thought experiment, I've actually been, in the last few days, writing my own modern version of this story. And if I were writing this story, I would have gotten that incriminating quote into the 2nd or 3rd graph. That's where you want it. That's where you want to grab people. In the end, Gibson's scoop should not be judged by the canons of 21st century news gathering, but by the standards of its time. By that measure, the story stands as a representative example of investigative reporting at a time when the profession of journalism was in its infancy. It would be decades before objectivity, accuracy, and fairness became the accepted standards by which daily newspaper journalism was judged. With the Credit Mobilier scoop, Gibson and the Sun dumped a dense, complicated, and error-filled mass of information into the laps of New York readers. The exposé spared no rhetorical embellishment and uncritically repeated every allegation made by Macomb. Even so, it consisted of more than sensational headlines and purple prose. Sworn testimony, supported by documentary evidence, appeared to implicate many of the nation's most prominent political figures, including the Vice President of the United States, in a shady scheme linked to an increasingly unpopular and distrusted enterprise supported by the federal government. For years, members of Congress and commentators such as Adams had warned of the potential for corruption raised by the Union Pacific and Credit Mobilier. The revelations in the Sun confirmed their worst fears. Over the course of the next 6 months, the revelations of the Sun preoccupied Washington and the nation. 3 congressional committees, 2 in the House, 1 in the Senate, investigated the company's reach into Congress. The nation's increasingly powerful and influential daily newspapers kept their readers apprised of daily developments and stoked indignation with searing headlines and indignant editorials. In the House, the investigation began behind closed doors. Perhaps lulled into a sense of security by the secret proceedings, Ames confirmed that he sold shares to Colfax, Garfield, Kelly, Henry Wilson, Senator James Patterson of New Hampshire, and others. He also testified candidly about his motivation. He denied any attempt to bribe or any attempt to extract promises in exchange for the stock, but he admitted his motives were not altruistic. I strove to use them, he said, referring to the shares, in a way that I thought most advantageous in spreading our influence everywhere. Unfortunately for Ames, his testimony would not stay behind closed doors. The decision to conduct the inquiry in private outraged the press and public, so much so that when Congress returned from its Christmas break, the House made opening up the proceedings its first order of business. No longer could members be confident that their testimony would be kept confidential or published later in a record few would read. Transcripts of testimony by Ames and other witnesses were released, and the dynamics of the investigation changed profoundly. Republican newspapers that initially waved off the Sun's expose were changing their minds. The New York Times, for example, which backed Grant, had dismissed the Credit Mobilier scoop as what it called a stupid falsehood shortly after its publication. The charge originally appeared in the Sun, which is prima facie evidence that it is a lie, the Times sneered. After the release of the transcripts and 3 weeks of public hearings, the Times came around to a different view. Ames' motives, the Times conceded, seemed to have been far from pure. Members who had bought Credit Mobilier shares and who had denied doing so initially after the Sun published its story were now even more eager to put as much distance between themselves and Ames as possible. One by one, they denied buying shares under oath or claimed to have backed out from the deal almost immediately. Ames and others affiliated with the Union Pacific looked on in disgust and anger. Durant, the one-time vice president of the Union Pacific and no friend of Ames, called the members who hemmed, hawed, and lied about their Credit Mobilier purchases pitiful martyr mouths. The testimony for the Ames family shovel-making business, the testimony of a bookkeeper for the Ames family shovel-making business offers a window into the growing tensions surrounding the investigation. George Kennedy clearly did not want to be there. When the bookkeeper for Oliver Ames and Sons testified before the Poland Committee on January 18th, his nervousness was plain for all to see. Scratching his head and seeming to doodle while taking questions, he answered reluctantly and almost inaudibly as William Merrick of Maryland inquired about Oakes Ames and Credit Mobilier. Have you any knowledge at all of the transactions of Mr. Ames and his dealings with Credit Mobilier stock? Merrick asked. No, sir, I do not know that I have any positive knowledge, Kennedy replied. You seem to discriminate as to positive knowledge and other sorts of knowledge, Merrick continued. What knowledge have you at all, whether positive or otherwise? I do not know that I have any knowledge. Are you sure that you have no knowledge? I do not know whether I am certain or not, Kennedy said. The Sun found this exchange very amusing and printed it under the heading, A Genuine Know-Nothing. But the episode illustrated the emotional toll taken by 4 months of headlines and hearings. Ames certainly wasn't laughing. And as a few days later, he decided to disclose all that he knew about the Credit Mobilier dealings he had with his colleagues. Over the course of 2 days, he revealed details about his dealings with Colfax, Garfield, Patterson, Pig Iron Kelly, and others. Garfield immediately grasped the seriousness of the situation. Ames, the future president, wrote in his diary, is evidently determined to drag down as many men with him as possible. He seems to be as bad a man as can well be. Well, as you can see, this is a complicated story, and not surprisingly, it does not conclude simply. After weeks of investigation, the committee led by Poland of Vermont presented its findings. It recommended the expulsion of Ames and Brooks and concluded that the members identified in the hearings as having bought Credit Mobilier shares indeed did so despite their denials. But it concluded that the lawmakers who bought the shares did not do so corruptly. In other words, the committee concluded that Ames offered a bribe, but those who bought the stock did not receive a bribe. This was pretty weak tea, but it proved too strong for the House, which ended up censuring rather than expelling Ames and Brooks. A Senate committee looking into the scandal called for the expulsion of Patterson, whose claims that he never bought Credit Mobilier shares were thoroughly shattered by Ames. But the Senate didn't even debate the findings. Congressional inaction was greeted with incredulity. It is a gross perversion of the facts to assume that the congressional participants did not know from where these spoils were derived, the Sacramento Union thundered. This part of the report is whitewash of the purest wash and will deceive no one. The political consequences were severe, and they were magnified by two additional developments. An end-of-session retroactive pay raise passed by Congress, dubbed the salary grab by critics, proved immensely unpopular. And then in the fall of 1873, a stock market crash kicked off the most severe economic crisis faced in the United States until the Great Depression. All things considered, voters were in no mood to reward the party in power. The Credit Mobilier scandal proved to be a powerful political phenomenon because of its association with railroads and the specter of big money corporate interests, who dominated legislatures from Albany to Sacramento. Heralded in the decades before the Civil War and celebrated in 1869 as the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the railroad industry had come to be seen by many as a sinister force, exercising too much control over the political system and the economic system. As he urged his colleagues to expel Ames and Brooks, Poland proved he was a better prophet than an inquisitor. He warned his colleagues that they must find a way to rein in the influence of what he called great money power. If they failed to do so, he warned, they will, quote, soon encounter a tempest of public judgment that will utterly overthrow many of their schemes, and there will be danger that the innocent will suffer with the guilty. He was a better forecaster than he knew. In 1874, in the greatest partisan swing of the 19th century, Democrats went from being a 110-seat minority to a 60-seat majority. The Credit Mobilier scandal represented a significant turning point in the politics of post-Civil War America. Starting as an election year newspaper expose, the scandal evolved into a political melodrama, as aggressive news coverage and commentary, as well as a seemingly endless series of political blunders, transfixed the public. It reinforced existing partisan and ideological divisions, but touched something deeper. The story of Credit Mobilier drew its power to scandalize from the anxieties produced by the forces driving profound change in the American economy. In doing so, it foreshadowed the tumultuous final decades of the 19th century, when Americans pushed back against monopoly power and political corruption. The ignoble reign of the King of Frauds cast a long shadow. Thank you for listening. Now, I'm sure you're all thoroughly confused, so fire away with questions. No, really? It's all crystal clear?
What grabbed you about this story that you felt like you had to write about it?
It was the challenge of, as my new friend here noted, this is something that is often referenced in history texts and economic histories of the period, but never really discussed as a political event. And as somebody who's been in the Washington journalism area for decades, I was kind of interested in telling that story because I've seen these scandals evolve and erupt and dominate the political discourse, and I wanted to see how this played out. So it was that. There's also an enormous amount of primary source material available to tell this story. The transcripts of the committees, especially the Poland Committee, are public documents and easily available. The Library of Congress has made newspapers available through its online Chronicling America archive, so there's just an enormous amount of primary source material that's available through the internet that you would not otherwise have found. So I'm intrigued by the language. I'm intrigued by the what I've discovered is the way the story touches on a lot of modern themes, the power and responsibilities of the press, the issues of corruption, and exactly how do interests make themselves felt in the legislative and political process. These are all live questions, and Credit Mobilier, I think, in some ways was a wake-up call, or at least it was the first time Americans really became one of the first times Americans became sensitized to how these things work. So all of those things drove my interest in this. Karen.
So given that, because it does seem like there's a lot of things there, why is this story just kind of brushed over in the annals of history?
Well, for one thing, it unfolds in the flyover territory of U.S. history. This is a remarkable bookstore, but you go into most bookstores, the U.S. history section is chock full of books about the Civil War, biographies of Lincoln, Washington, and Roosevelt, and maybe a few Kennedy assassination conspiracy theory books. There isn't that much interest in this period. That's for openers. Secondly, I think there's a problem with this. The story is very complicated. It's difficult to tell in a cogent, comprehensible way. Additionally, most of the principles in the story are quite obscure. I mean, who's heard of Pig Iron Kelly until tonight, right? Oaks Ames is well known to railroad buffs and Iowans. Ames, Iowa is named after him. Most of the figures are not very well known. So it's complicated. It doesn't have a satisfying ending. Weeks and weeks of hearings and investigations and revelations, and they let everybody off the hook. That's kind of an anticlimax. So there are a lot of factors that I think conspire to keep this story from the mainstream of American history.
It's interesting that I feel like the Iran-Contra affair, for instance, is just kind of sliding off into.
Well, that's an interesting. That's an interesting observation, and I well remember the Iran-Contra affair and the hearings. And one of the things that happened then that reminded me of something that happened here is that, Oliver North changed the course of that investigation by getting up before the committee in his full dress uniform and jaw sticking out, basically denied wrongdoing, and that changed the course of the investigation. I was reminded of that thinking about Oaks Ames, who had always, whenever he testified before the committees, had always said, well, I did sell stock to these guys. But when they denied, in public, denied ever buying stock from him, he came back and detailed his transactions with these members. And then, when there was still some uncertainty, he actually went up to his home in Massachusetts and came back with some documentary evidence in the form of a notebook he kept of records. And so he doubled down and he changed the course of this thing, because I suspect that those guys, Garfield and Colfax and Kelly and the others thought they were going to get away with you know, a denial that would you know, sort of tamp down the public interest in this. But Ames wasn't having any of that because he wasn't willing to be the only one left hanging high and dry. So there is in sort of the dynamics of the way these things unfold, there is that similarity, a moment when a witness testimony changes or amplifies the course of the investigation. It reminded me also a little bit of Alexander Butterfield announcing the existence of the White House tapes in 1973. That turned the Watergate hearing up to 11 and really changed the course of things. Tyler.
How did the scandal affect the actual railroad construction and the actual...
Well, that's a good question. There is a school of thought that says the Panic of 1873, which commenced because Jay Cooke, who was building the Northern Pacific out of Duluth, he was no longer able to sell his bonds, and he had to close his banking house as a result, and one thing collapsed after another, and pretty soon the New York Stock Exchange had to close for a few days. There's a school of thought that says the reaction of the press and the public to this scandal contributed to that by making the purchase of railroad securities more undesirable. I'm not sure I buy that theory, because there were other factors that made Cooke's bonds undesirable, not the least of which was that the U.S. Army was out west battling Indians so that they could build the right-of-way, and a certain self-promoting general named George Armstrong Custer was writing about these battles for the New York Herald, and that, as much as anything else, discouraged people from buying Cooke's securities. Who wants to invest in a railroad when, you know, there's going to be war along the line? So there is that school of thought. I'm just not sure how much credence to put into it. It certainly reflected a change. One of the things that's interesting about this scandal, I mean, if something, this sounds almost too basic, but if something is scandalous, it has to scandalize somebody, right? What is there about this episode that scandalized people? And I think the answer is not that they were trading and self-dealing in stocks, but that there was all this insider dealing involving railroad stocks. The railroad industry was becoming increasingly unpopular in the United States. It is about at this time that the Granger movement took off with real force in the states of the Midwest and the Upper South. And farmers were flocking to the Granger movement because they'd had it up to here with monopoly power abuses by railroads and their control and corrupt control often of state legislatures. So this scandal, I don't think in and of itself had much effect on railroad construction. There were other things going on affecting the industry that and the desirability of investing in railroads that the scandal in and of itself did not really have much to do with.
Is there a hero?
No. There really isn't. I mean, there are some characters who, for instance, Luke Potter Poland comes as close to being a hero as anybody in this drama, but he correctly foresaw that there would be a huge price to pay if Congress didn't act decisively to respond to the revelations that his committee had unearthed. So in that sense, he was prophetic and courageous. However, the conduct of his investigation left a lot to be desired, and their conclusions were crazy. I mean, nobody in America, except maybe lawyers, a handful of lawyers, thought that the distinction between offering a bribe and not receiving a bribe could really held much water. And yet that was the basis of their conclusion. Moreover, they made no attempt, as far as I can tell, to investigate whether members who bought Credit Mobilier shares actually were affected in the conduct of their legislative business, and there is some reason to believe that they were. I found a couple of instances of members who had bought Credit Mobilier shares acting on behalf of the Union Pacific when you wouldn't really expect these guys who weren't really members of the Pacific Railroad Committee to be doing so. There is some evidence that there was some quid pro quo going on. But they simply chose not to explore that. Whether that was because it was a small committee and they didn't have much time, or they made a calculated decision early on to limit the scope of their investigation, I can't say. But in any event, Poland is the closest person I can come up with as a hero, because he at least had the courage to warn his brothers in Congress what might happen if they didn't do anything. It is a story in which you look in vain for somebody who is a complete white knight, I'm afraid. Maybe that's another reason nobody's written about it. So, before I let you all go, there is one thing I wanted to share, and that is, my first book was about James B. Weaver. He, for those who don't know, he was an Iowa populist of the 19th century, whose political career was a fascinating arc. He had been a Republican in the 1850s and throughout the war and into the mid-1870s. Then he joined the third-party Greenback Labor Party, was the populist candidate for president in 1892, and carried 4 states, the first third-party candidate to carry any states since 1860. Now, Weaver, in a way, the arc of Weaver's career illustrates what I was talking about earlier regarding railroads. As an editor in Bloomfield, Iowa in 1865, he was all about championing railroad development and urging Bloomfield to do what it took to get a railroad line. He said, "Rip Van Winkle must wake up. These railroads have to come to Bloomfield." By 1875, as a Republican candidate for the state Senate, he was running against his Democratic foe and making an issue of this guy's support for railroads. By the time he was the populist candidate for president in 1892, he was foursquare behind the populist call for government control of the railroads, and in a book he wrote, he said that trusting the railroads, or indeed any other industry, to be governed by the profit motive was a huge mistake, and he borrowed heavily from the language of Paul in the book of Romans describing the evils of lust. And he basically substituted the idea of profit for lust and said, you cannot, idea is an enmity to the laws of man and God and cannot be countenanced. The arc of Weaver's thinking on railroads is very illustrative of the dynamic that made this scandal so scandalous. People were becoming increasingly frustrated with and angry at the economic and political power of railroads. And so if there's a unifying field theory of these two books, that might be it. So, well, thank you very much. There are books to be bought, and I'm delighted to sign them if you are so moved to do so. Thank you very much.